Hi guys, welcome to Simple Programming. In our previous video, we kickstarted our journey into JSON Web Token with the help of filters. We did not use Spring Security components there. In this video, we are going to use Spring Security components and code in a more elegant and production-ready manner for JSON Web Tokens. Alright guys, I've created a simple Spring Boot application and here's my pom.xml. So I've added the Spring Boot Starter Web, I've added the Spring Boot Starter Security, and I have the JSON Web Token dependency here along with the common lang3, the util files which I'm going to use in my application. So these are the four different dependencies that I'm going to inject. And now let's go to our configuration. I have a security config which is going to have at the rate of enable web security, which is going to enable security at a global level, and then I have enable global method security, which is going to enable security at method level if I want to use at the rate of pre-authorized or at the rate of secured. Okay, so then what I have done is like I'm going to extend the security config with web security configure adapter, and it provides customization for web security features. And here I'm going to use authentication manager bean. So this authentication manager bean is now included to my security config. So this authentication manager is like a parent which is going to hold all your authentication provider instances. So when you do authentication manager dot authenticate, right, it's going to delegate a chain of authentication provider instances. So we are going to use this authentication manager in this case. Okay, so then I've configured the configure method. I've overridden is the configure method from web security configure adapter, and I'm going to say my authentication provider is going to be my token authentication provider. All right, then I've created a bean for my filter, and the filter is going to take the authentication manager, and then there's a authentication success handler. Then I have the configure for HTTP security, and it's going to authorize any matches to slash secured, and slash secured should be authenticated. And in case of exception, it's going to call the authentication entry point, and then I'm going to return an error message 401 unauthorized. And then I'm going to add this filter, which is going to be my authentication token filter before the username password authentication filter. So this is my configuration. Now let's go on to a filter first. So I have created a token authentication filter, which is going to extend the abstract authentication processing filter. So there are different filters that you can make use of. For example, you can even make use of the username password authentication filter, once per request filter. You can even use a generic filter. So in order to make it more, elegant, right, I'm going to use the abstract authentication processing filter. Abstract authentication processing filter gives you a bunch of methods that you can use to, to do different operations on your authentication. So here what I'm going to do is I'm going to override the attempt authentication and successful authentication methods here. And in the attempt authentication, when my request comes in with the header token, right, I'm going to do a set of validations just to make sure that the token is valid. So it's going to have the prefix as QWERTY. One of the reasons why I kept it as QWERTY is to show that it can be of any string. It doesn't have to be always bearer in it. It can be of any string that you want. You can even apply a first level of authentication right to this text also. So then once that is done, I'm going to create an authentication token. So this authentication token is nothing but the user password authentication token. So I created a model authentication token which is going to extend the user password authentication token. The user password authentication token has things like credentials, principal, is authenticated. It's going to have the token in it. There are a lot of things that you can make use of. So I'm going to extend my authentication token model class with username password authentication token. So once that is done, once authenticated, what I'm going to do is I'm going to send it to the authentication manager to authenticate. When I do this, right, it's going to invoke all the authentication providers that I have in my bucket, and it's going to authenticate the token along different rules. So let's go on to one of those authentication providers that I have created here. So I've created an authentication provider, and it's going to extend the abstract user detail authentication provider. There's a provider manager also which you can use. So here I've overridden additional authentication checks. I don't have anything here, so I just left it as it is. Then I have the retrieve user. In this retrieve user, I'm going to pass my token and try to extract the claim from the token. Once the claim is extracted, then I'm going to create a new user login details, which is nothing but the user details object, and return back to the to the web security. Okay, so pretty straightforward. So if you have one more authentication provider, right? So once you do authentication manager dot authenticate, it's going to call every authentication provider and and do does authentication on it. So once this particular authentication provider executes and our claim successfully gets created and all these things is done, right, it goes to the success handler. So success handler is nothing but an additional layer where you can validate and reroute your request depending upon the role. This authentication object is going to contain all the information about the about the user. It's going to contain the username, password, and it's going to contain the roles, everything. So the authorities that are provided for that role, everything is going to be present here. And if your application has some business rules to reroute the user depending upon their rules, right, you can very well do this here at the authentication success handler. So these are the three different security filters that I have in place. And then let's move on to our token controller. So when the user tries to access my token controller, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pretty much straightforward. I'm going to do jwts.build. I'm going to set the subject as client text. The client ID is going to be set as the ID. Then I'm going to set the issue date and the expiration date with I'm going to set the expiration date, which is going to be 60 seconds. And then I'm going to sign this with a signature algorithm HS512. You can very well do HS256, or there are different algorithms available. You can do whatever, whichever one is suits you better. All right, and pretty straightforward. And in a regular production case, right, what you'll do is like you'll get this client text, you'll validate it with the incoming details against a database, then create an object and send back in an elegant way. So you can even add a functionality to refresh the token. Most applications will not give access to create or view your credentials, so I would not recommend that. The other important thing that I wanted to say here is like try to give one error message. Don't try to give specific error messages. Like for example, let's say this client ID in this client ID does not match with the database, right? Don't throw an error message like the client ID does not match, client text does not match. Don't say like your that the particular element does not match, expiration, all these things, right? Try to give one message that is unauthorized, for unauthorized, because once someone registers with your API, you would be providing all the contract and every other possible details to them. So once an application registers with you, it's going to be seamless authentication and authorization across your different requests. So you don't have to give specific requests. If you give specific requests, right, you're pretty much exposing your API in a bad manner. So try to keep that in mind when you develop your applications. The secure controller is going to be of secured API request mapping. It's just going to say welcome. Okay. So if you want to use user specific and method level securities, right, you can very well use pre-authorized secured to it, because we are already enabled it with the help of enable global method security annotation. All right. So let's quickly take a look at our login user details object before we run this application. The login user details object is going to implement the user detail objects of the security dependency, and we are going to have a username, token ID, and different authorities. So these authorities are being set as roles in your claim when you generate your token. Right. Pretty straightforward. Going to my application.yaml, I don't have anything here. You don't have to do management.security.enable. These things have been deprecated in Spring Boot, and there are things that you used to do in the earlier versions of Spring Boot, but you can pretty well eliminate it. So my application.yaml is pretty much empty except for security and a server.port as 9001. So now let's go ahead and run this application. The application has been started. Now let's go to our Postman and take a look at this behavior. So here I'm here at my token. Let me go to my header. I'll show you my header. My client ID is going to be 12345. My client text is going to be Walmart, and there's no body, and it's going to be a post, and I'm going to hit the token URI. So when I click on this, I'm going to get a response, which is going to be the token, and it says authenticated true, principals, credentials, details, authorities, names, all the things you can configure, because what we have done here is like our authentication token is going to extend the username password authentication token. So that's an advantage of doing that. Instead of sending a string, right, just a string, you can send it in a more elegant way by using a JSON object. Okay, so in this case, you can configure all these things and send it in a very good way. Okay, so let's take this token. Let's go to a new tab. So what we're going to do is like we're going to add a new header as authorization, and our bearer text is going to be QWERTY. Give you a token here. And when you click on send, it's going to return back welcome, which means our token has been accepted and authenticated. Let's remove this token and let's try to hit our secure API. It's going to throw 401 unauthorized. This 401 unauthorized is straight away coming from the authentication entry point that we have configured in the Spring Security configuration. This is a very simple example of JWT authentication with Spring Boot application and Spring components. The different takeaways that I would advise for you is like try to integrate this with a database, try to create tables with authorization and authentication elements in it, and try to authenticate the user for token, try to see how the expiration works, and try to configure different claim objects in your JWT as a token, and that's how you would improve. Okay, thanks for watching, and please subscribe for more such videos.